Okay, I have two thoughts about that, and I would actually include the current George Floyd demonstrations and protests as part of that, because I think in terms of public space is the first thing I would talk about. I think there's been happily a sudden awareness of the value and the importance of public space, both in terms of the COVID pandemic and when we're starved of it, how much we miss it,
Yeah.
and how much we need it, and how much we probably need more in terms of physical distancing and so on. And secondly, a newfound awareness of the right of people to express their First Amendment rights to protest and safely in public space in a way that New York City has struggled with in the past few weeks, and I think has heightened the importance of having places to do that. So I think that's one thing, that's sort of outside. And of course there's a whole other series of changes inside that we don't even yet know about.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple thoughts about it. I mean, I think, and I'd be curious to see what you think about this, David, but I think public space was changing and mutating pre-COVID. And it's both a pandemic issue and I think a socio-political issue as well, in terms of the ways that I've been observing it. I think I think in the 21st century, the desire for public space is very different than it was in the 19th century. So the current model of public space that we tend to think about is public space that is very French. It's built on the French Enlightenment model, the enfilade, the promenade, and I would argue the society of the spectacle. The more people you crowd it with and fill it with, the more public value it's got. The square, the plaza, etc. If you look at the spaces of value, and I think this moves across racial lines, and it obviously has some value in post-COVID, I think people are actually looking for public spaces that have semi-public capacities, small gatherings, ways that they can use the space for sustained durations of time rather than just running through it or looking at it. And so the scale of public space, I think it's becoming more intimate. So you want the engagement, you want the exchange, but you also want some level of being able to curate and manage that on your own. So I often use Anthony Garnier's Paris Opera House as a very dated example, where you go into the lobby and you've got to see everybody. The optics of that space are to make it public in Paris. I've got to see everyone, and therefore it's public. And that has to do with breaking down social classes. The optics of that space are breaking down social barriers. They're spectacular. I'm showing off, etc., and so forth. Disney Concert Hall to me is a very different model, which is probably criticized in planning in urban circles. But the compression of the lobby, which is very, very tight and very vertical, produces a lot of very small pockets that are actually incredible spaces to hang out in and are cherished by the public of LA. Maybe it's more in an automotive circumstance, but if I think about Alice Tully Hall, also in New York at Lincoln Center, and Diller and Scafidio's rework of Lincoln Center, what it did was break down a lot of those spaces in ways that they foster, I think, an equal amount of social gathering and interaction between different classes and audiences and publics that don't normally mingle, but it's not in a big field. So to me, that's something that I speculate could be part of the thinking that's explored by designers of how you're kind of trying to deal with both of these somewhat diametrically opposed ideas, because public space, when you're talking about protests, it's all about numbers of people in one place at one time to show a kind of
to prove a point.
Yeah, to prove a point. It's forced by numbers. But whether it's in Hong Kong or New York, you've also seen moments of more dispersed, fragmented, and pocketed protest models that aren't following that late 19th, 20th century model as much anymore. Even here, they're much more broken out than they were in the 60s.
I think that's partly a function of the steady erosion and elimination of big public spaces.
Yeah.
And when you talk about Paris, I mean, there's been this whole kind of Haussmann type impact in New York, where they redesigned Union Square so there's no room to gather anymore. They closed Zuccotti Park. So there's been this, I think, really negative approach to large public space gatherings. And I think it's counterproductive. I don't think it reduces the need for people to demonstrate. It just means that they get more congested and they take to the streets and so on. But you know, the other thing is, some things never change. When you talk about Guy Debord and the Society of the Spectacle, but even Holly White and Jan Gehl, in their observations of people using public space, say people go where there are other people, and they go to watch other people. And so they always. So I think there's that persistent need for social interaction in public space.
And isolation in New York will never be the answer. Nobody moves here for that.
No.
We all want to be engaged. You know, you come here because of the socio-political ecology of things.
You don't come for solitude.
Right, and I think even more than LA, you know, you come here to move through that and very much be a part of it. So I think whatever that model is, I guess I'm just observing that it's not appropriate to say that intimacy and smaller scale is fundamentally a bad form of public space. I don't think that question's been answered yet. But it can't be coupled with isolation.
No, I think
it absolutely cannot be coupled with isolation. It has to find, and you know, I don't know. There a lot of the parks, the East Side, they're very linear, and so how you get how you dilate those to foster different scales of interaction, I think is a good problem, but it's a challenging problem that is only going to have more constraints put on it because of COVID. You know, again, they're going against the grain, I think, to some extent.
The other interesting sort of post-COVID thing is the street closings. So like in my neighborhood, they've been closing streets on a temporary basis, and people are like, wow, this is great, you know. We shouldn't give this one up, you know. And so I think the way we use our streets may well be, I mean, that's, again, as you said earlier, has been steadily changing over time anyway. Addressing the balance between cars and bikes and pedestrians. And, you know, beginning with Janet Khan, and ever since we've been working on that. But I think it's gotten another push with the pandemic, because people have gotten used to those street closings and are prepared to give up the parking in order to enjoy the public space.
Sure. And things like the pedestrianization of Times Square. I don't know if you were involved in any of the policy of that.
Absolutely.
I suspected you were. While that's been incredible, I think for Times Square, I mean, I think limiting that to the kind of iconic spaces, it would be interesting. And as you know, we're all doing some work on this at Pratt in different programs, asking these questions about what is the street of the 21st century? How can that, you know, one trajectory we've been looking at is how does that become the new garden or the new backyard? And I think that's to some extent a little bit of what we've seen happening over these past few weeks.
You know Trent Lethko, Arab?
I don't. No.
Arab's been modeling, doing population modeling for buildings that are reoccupied. So you have the problem. The key to the problem is really the elevator. Because if you decide
lifting is everything.
Only allowed
I know
4
that
people,
well from my time in Hong Kong.
There you go. So, but if you're only allowed one person in each corner of the elevator, then that backs up everything else, right? And you can get a certain number of people in the lobby. But their model shows that everybody else is out on the sidewalk. So how do you manage that? The waiting time. Now you can stagger start times, and you can do these other things in the model, but whatever they do, they've got people backed up on the sidewalk. So how do you accommodate them in New York City, in Midtown, with people trafficking past the building and people waiting? And they're talking about taking out the curb vehicle lane and using that as part of the waiting area to get into buildings. So
well, there's a few different things I think we could talk about here. I want to respond to what you just brought up, maybe with just some off-the-cuff thinking. One model I could imagine is that, and there would be a height limit in this scenario.
Right.
It would probably top out around 5 stories, but it's not going to be what you and I are currently looking at, right? It's not going to be that commercial center, but and so there would be a question of limits. But anybody who doesn't need ADA accessibility, you could essentially suggest that they're using stairs.
Take the stairs.
And so I think there's a way,
which is healthy, by the way.
Right. You could generate electricity with it, but there might be a very interesting opportunity to rethink the stair of the 21st century. If it's not just getting us from floor to floor, but we think more mezzanine and big landings, particularly in refurbishments, even if they're refurbishments of recent buildings like these. You could think of breaking up the floor plates in a way that they become essentially landings, so that you're not it's no longer 0 to 12. There's obviously the neoliberal tech world has developed a whole bunch of mapping systems to determine where somebody is, but if you think about ways to consider the smart use of management space, it doesn't necessarily mean I need to be on the same floor at the same desk. I might need to be in the same building. But if you start to think of multi-floor scenarios, and one building comes to mind, the Gherkin, that Foster's office did. You could imagine that kind of a model on steroids, where it also has a different real estate model, would have to be coupled with this, where it's a kind of cooperatively shared space, but everybody's kind of moving around in different ways, so that maybe some days I'm only on the 3rd floor, other days I might have to go up to the 5th. Maybe it's skip-stop lifts, so you have 5-floor chunks.
Well, look at the Times building. Renzo Piano's Times building. They have interconnecting stairs between floors.
Exactly.
So you're on your floor. You have to see your editor. You go up one floor. You have to see whoever you go down a floor. But you don't have to go near the elevator, which is way at the back of the building. So that's a much more efficient use of. The other thing about staircases is, before the invention of the elevator, the staircases were the great architectural opportunity, right?
Yeah.
3-dimensional space,
they're still
sculptural.
As an architect, they're still incredible.
Yes, I know. And what now?
But they are.
And now they get pushed to the corner of the building in the dark, blah, blah, blah. We have to rethink that. We have to bring back the staircase as an architectural item, as a special contribution to the building. Yeah. And it'll get us past some of these elevator blockages.
Yeah. And there's so much technology out there. Skip-stop express lifts. I'm forgetting the name of the lifting system that's very prevalent in Hong Kong, but has just started showing up here in New York.
They're kind of scary though. You have to sort of jump on as they're going past.
Exactly, but if you couple that with new experiments with stairs that are maybe closer to terraces and mezzanines, oversized landings, etc. You could end up doing some interesting things. It's not going to have the level of efficiency, strictly speaking, but there's a very interesting building that I don't know if you know the architect Eric Owen Moss.
Oh yes.
So Eric did a building which is an adaptive reuse in LA. It's nicknamed the Pterodactyl. It's on top of a parking garage. It took like 20 years to build. They did the parking garage first, and it's almost a kind of renovation of that parking garage. But that building doesn't have incredibly efficient floor plate usage from a strict real estate perspective, but it's had enormous equity in the lifestyle of the companies that have been occupying it. Because of the different tempos and cadences, you get these small, it's similar, has some similarities to the discussion about public space, because there are these weird different scales of spaces, and because it's broken up and there are different vertical circuits, they can see one another and feel connected, so they're not isolated. There's a lot of exchange between floors and people, but there's also areas that I can go hide in and think and incubate in, or do yoga, do other kinds of less public activities, let's say, in that space that's given it some popularity. It's rented much more. At least it had the last time I walked through it with Eric, much more frequently than one would have ever imagined.
Right.
If you just looked at it from a strict real estate perspective. So those types of models we could see showing up more.
The other sort of big challenge post-COVID is transportation.
Yes.
Because all these buildings, my wife just started going back to the office again. She has to get to Houston Street from Brooklyn.
Yep.
And she's riding the subway, and it's a terrifying experience. Apparently there's no.
Yeah, my wife's a frontliner.
Until
so
we
she
get
has to go in every
vaccine,
day.
it's a problem. And one can hard pressed to see how we solve that problem, really, because mass transit in New York City was always at capacity anyway.
You did some work on that.
Yeah, I mean, just really tough, and I don't know the answer to it.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Well, I think there's some. One model is people aren't working at home, but they're also not working within 10 minutes from home, either by foot or bike or by some alternative mode of transit.
Or you stagger people's work times. You don't have them all coming in at 9 o'clock, whatever.
But that comes back to the street question to some extent. I think, we've been working a bit with Jessica Schumer and the BQX model, and I don't think light rail's the answer. I mean, one of the things that I always loved about Hong Kong and have always admired and am envious of now that I reside in New York is the multimodality of their transit system. And I know that Andrew Mead, who's the head of the MTR there, has been looking at a lot of autonomous vehicle, short run, small car, non-rail additions to what the MTR might consider as future stations, which I'm sure I would just participate in an interview with Oculus magazine that was looking at some of this. I'm sure that will come online, but I think actually the finer grain, the scooters, the bicycles, these other modes, those are going to put pedestrians and cars and alternative modes of transit in greater conflict. And
it's
so
already happening.
It is. And so that
the scooters and the bicycles.
It immediately asks the question of what the street is. And I think one thing that we've been asking and wondering is, again, it's a very 19th century French model. The concept of the street comes out of Paris, that the street comes first, the sidewalks and the buildings come second. That's organized by the state. It's part of the metabolism of the city, if you will. Trash, waste, everything. And the finances and the real estate models follow that, which is your lot and property as it's known is not part of the street. And I wonder if there's some room to begin exploring that, at least as research models. Could buildings begin to absorb more street, is the way that I talk about this. Could they be a kind of inverted porte cochere, if you will? Instead of it going over the street, it absorbs part of it.
A bit like the POPs program, the privately owned public spaces that are actually on private property.
Could that have a financial capacity to it that can't be fictitiously tricked out by developers, but it is actually helping to manage some of that and widen the street and open up some of that street space? If you could of course couple that with getting rid of cars, but I wonder if that's an interesting model. It's more concave, more centripetal. It's pulling things in to the building as opposed to grabbing more street. But that has to have a property and finance model potentially to go with it.
One of the reasons I love living in New York City is that we're not quite at what the mayor of Paris wants in the 15-minute city, in the sense that you can live, work, eat, recreate, sleep all within 15 minutes. But you can almost do that in most parts of New York City.
Brooklyn has been a real big instigator in
absolutely
that model.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I mean, this is the first time I've been in Manhattan in months. I'm in my little neighborhood in Brooklyn. I have everything I need. I go to the Prospect Park. So I think that's something that a lot of cities don't have. A lot of cities are very segregated, with commercial districts, residential suburbs, with no retail. no recreation, no culture. And I think our model is a much more successful urban model.
Yeah,